And somehow that was twisted to make me out to be someone who was hateful or who was trying to incite hate.
Several university students and staff we spoke with had experienced intimidation and harassment for their views on Palestine. Some didn't want to be on camera. Some were afraid for their safety or facing professional consequences.
I want to work in healthcare and carry my identity, something that I cannot even change, can attribute to that and can ruin that for me.
Though some had already lost jobs.
I had a job lined up after graduation, and my employer told me that they would be rescinding the offer that I already accepted because of Palestine organizing, because they basically told me that I was doing and interpreted as support for terrorism.
As soon as you raise terrorism in this country, particularly post 9/11, I mean, you're really upping the ante, right? In this world right now, if you're on campus talking about ceasefire, you're being called both anti-Semitic and a supporter of terror.
You know, there's a lot of talk about keeping safe our Jewish students who feel uncomfortable by advocacy on behalf of Palestine. And I have a great deal of sympathy for what those students are experiencing. But there hasn't been any talk about how this impacts our Jewish students who are committed to justice and peace in Palestine, or how it impacts our Palestinian students.
I spoke about my family at institution. I talked about how they were bombed and how we were trying to find their bodies under the rubble. And for doing that, I received a disciplinary notice from my university.
So you feel like you don't have the freedom to simply just say, stop the violence?
Yeah, like there's no way, but that would go well in that department.
The basic question is, do the lives of Palestinians matter? And one of the premises of this suppression is that they don't, and nobody should be talking about them, and no one has a right to talk about them.
Columbia University did not respond to our requests for an interview. But leaked audio, here's what the university's vice president, Gerald Rosberg, had to say about Palestine protests.
I could imagine that somebody listening to that said an Israeli student being told that their state is an apartheid state, a racist state committing genocide, seems to them like an incitement of violence against them.
Meanwhile, Mariam and her classmates who are advocating for Palestinian rights continue to get hate mail and death threats.
One of the emails was like, swinging from a rope, that's where Islamic trash belongs. People telling us to kill ourselves. They're saying the same thing to my Jewish friends. They're calling them not real Jews.
But there's one message that still haunts her.
If you want to shutting down these mother... Okay? Good story.
It was something a Columbia employee told the college radio station at one of the protests.
I'm an officer of administration. I'm Jewish, okay? I'm a Zionist, okay? I hope every one of these people die, okay?
I haven't listened to it in a while. I didn't think that I would have like a reaction to it again.
What is your reaction to it?
I am like really scared. And people are like, oh, how are you? If you're scared, then just stop. But I can't, because the whole point is to scare me to the point that I don't do this anymore.
How long can you keep doing this?
Until my last breath. Like, and maybe it can have influence our government. I don't know. But at the very least, I think other Palestinians are seeing it, and they're seeing that they're not alone.
We're seeing the biggest protests for Palestine rights, for human rights, against genocide, in my lifetime in the United States. The folks who want to kill, protest, and absolutely delegitimize and criminalize free speech on Israel-Palestine see correctly that universities are their biggest challenge.
Throughout history, students on U.S. college campuses have been on the front lines for social change. And I think Israel and its staunchest allies recognize that. That is why they are engaging in an all-out war on U.S. college campuses. They are waiting for us to leave. But rest assured, if it's not us, it'll be a new wave of students back home.
All right. Okay, if I can have Josh and Amina sit here with the yeah. Okay, so if you'd like to give us a few words about the documentary before we move on to questions, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So first, thank you for what you do with the State Department. Anyone here with an Instagram has probably seen and trying to get some truth out of the State Department, and I admire it so much. Fault Lines is this show. We've been on about 15 years on Al Jazeera English. Our purview is the United States of America and how it fits into this kind of international mosaic that AJE tries to share with its audience. Each episode is about a half-hour long, generally investigative documentary, always documentary, generally investigative, but they take 3 or 4 months to do. And I share that because one of the things that was unusual about this piece is we filmed it in January. Is that this year? This year, right? But this was filmed and it went through the whole 3-month process of being written and edited and released. And it got released weeks before what everyone here saw, the military crackdown on students across the country at different campuses. And so rarely, because it takes us so long to do these things, rarely do we have a story out in a timely fashion on them, much less actually ahead of this. This story got much, much worse after we finished it with the police crackdown, not just in Columbia, but UCLA and all over the place. And it continues to get worse. When you look at a tenured professor was just fired for a repost on Instagram from months before. That's this week. When you look at NYU changed their rules for coming back to campus, where now criticism of Zionism, not even people, but the ideology of Zionism is seen as harassment. So we can no longer talk about this political ideology at NYU University. And I'm sure you want to share some experience as well with academia, with what's happening on the West Coast. This is Amina Waheed. Actually, I'm Josh Rushing, I'm the guy as well. But this is Amina Waheed. She was basically the director and the producer of this piece and a longtime Fault Lines producer.
Yeah, thanks for that, Josh. And thank you, Saeed. I'm totally fangirling here. Yeah, no, I mean, just to go off of what Josh said, I mean, this is, when this film came up as an idea and I was seeing what was happening on campuses, and I have a lot of I know a lot of academics within my circles, and I knew what was happening, and we could have made this film 10, 20 years ago, even beyond. In this moment, it felt particularly severe, especially in the weeks and months following October 7th, and we saw this upswell in public support for Palestinian rights in a way that maybe we hadn't really seen, like in terms of mobilization. But I wanted to share, like, there's just some examples since. Like we had, there's a Black Muslim PhD candidate who has been suspended and is getting deported, as far as we know, from Cornell. I had actually talked to him when I was doing research for this film, Mamadou Tall. And they were, getting a lot of harassment back then in the weeks after October 7th. But even, so I live in Los Angeles. I'm a Los Angeles-based journalist with Fault Lines. And even within LA, when you think about the West Coast, being quite liberal, But we have at least 2 cases of this kind of what they call Palestine exception to free speech. I mean, we have the Irvine 11, if anyone is familiar with that case. We have the LA 8, which is a little bit many years before that, about there was an attempt to deport a group of Arab students for their organizing efforts for Palestinian rights. And that case only recently in the last maybe, I don't know, it was the last couple of years has been, like they finally like lifted the case. These people are, you know, I don't want to say how old they are now, but they're older now. So this has been going on for a long time, but we felt like this was the moment to really tell this story in the event of, well, what was happening. Like it was quite severe, right? In terms of the censorship, in terms of this kind of McCarthy feel, but to another level. And you know, someone when I was sort of pre-interviewing said this very interesting thing, which was that sort of the foundation of censorship is insecurity, right? It's sort of a society not having confidence in itself. So I felt like that's very, as severe as sort of this crackdown was, also meant that people were, like there was strength in the mobilization that was happening. Like there was a certain fear and it was a response to that fear. And that sort of very extreme censorship and the actions that we're taking. So
there are 2 things that the Professor Laura, who you see in the middle from GW, she left the States. She's now in Doha where she feels safer teaching. But what's important about her case is that was before October 7th. This goes back before October 7th. An update on Miriam, the student that you see in there. She just actually hit me up on Instagram this weekend. She just got arrested again, protesting. And so she's still fighting, and they won't stop. And if there's any silver lining in the dark, dark clouds of these days, is that this movement of people seeing Palestinians as human beings, it's stronger now than in my lifetime that I've seen it. And as horrible as things are now, that's my one hope, is that this movement keeps going and it doesn't stop. I know that some question. Yeah, do you want to, we're going to open this up some questions here and then questions to you guys next. Yeah.
Okay, I want to ask you, how hard was it or how challenging was it to find people for the documentary, considering the fear of doxing or, of course, being labeled as anti-Semitic?
Not as hard as I need to think back.
Well, to go on camera, we had to do that whole scene of how many people did we call?
I called a lot of people. Yeah. I mean, there was a big calling tree, but called a lot of people. A lot of people were scared, but actually, I wanted to capture 2 things. I wanted to capture the reality that there is a chilling effect, right? It's very real. People are scared of losing their jobs, about their futures, their students, they have their whole life ahead of them. It's especially was very difficult to get anyone that was in the medical field. Like if you're a resident or you're if you're a student that's going to become a physician, you're in medical schools, they were especially fearful, right? Like I went through so much school. This is a lot to put on the line. That being said, I was also surprised that there are a lot of people, especially young people. I think when it was actually the students who they had their whole futures ahead of them that were actually the most open, I would say, and the most kind of brave about going on camera in a lot of ways. It was actually people who were in positions who were older, who were professors, who were more established, that couldn't really talk to us. That said, like, I have too much going on and like, or I'm getting hit from all sides. There's actually a lot of the younger people who were quite brave despite what could have been a lot of consequences that they faced in terms of going forward. So I was kind of pleasantly surprised and quite, and I was very impressed by the sort of bravery, given we've seen how much, what kind of severe consequences they can face, right? What kind of disciplinary actions, et cetera. So I don't know, it was a mix, but you know, like there was definitely like one of those, she was a pharmacy student and she's like, you know, my parents are really scared that I'm even doing this, even though you don't know who I am, you don't have my name, you're not going to reveal it. And but they themselves, within, even though they don't want to go on camera, they're very active on their campuses, so people know who they are. So I think it's interesting because that's always an interesting kind of question that I get is the impact of that. And it's a little bit of both, but I felt from my experience
A
overall.
tenured law school professor had to back out of the interview because of political pressure on her.
Oh, yeah, she was getting very severe, and so she had someone step in on her.
You would think that kind of person would feel protected.
Two tenured who couldn't go on record, even though they were quite vocal in support. It was just, I mean, I feel like, you know, this was in the time of a lot of these hearings that they were having.
Right, the congressional hearings with the presidency were time Bureau of Elections.
Okay. And what actions do you hope your viewers will take after this documentary?
You know, for me, that we never put a call to action at the end of any of our documentaries, and we cover up a wide array of subjects. Like I just did an investigation into the illicit trade of shark fins. Just had finished another one on the availability of research drugs that are being promoted to young kids online to they're kind of like steroids, but they're really dangerous and shouldn't be used that way. So it's like a wide array. We never really have like a call to action afterward. I see our role as journalists is just to try to shine the light on it. And then whatever someone does with that information, that's what they do with it. But for us, we're just really obsessed with the truth and trying to get that out there. And then that's our job.
And about shining a light on it, can you talk more about the title of the documentary, The Palestine Exception? What do you mean by the Palestine exception, if you can really well? I know it was briefly talked about in the documentary, but it'd be nice to talk about it here as well.
It's essentially the idea that talking about anything is okay, it's part of free speech. But when it comes to talking about Palestine, Palestinian rights, the end to an occupation, that is deemed, that doesn't fit within, that's not allowed. And that's okay to sort of say that that's not part of free speech and to really start to pull away at the free speech, to pull back on free speech and sort of, it's okay to, I say this, it's okay to sort of crush free speech when it comes to Palestine.
It's not just with speech, though.
No, it's not just
We were
with
just
speech,
talking
you're
to Jamal Bowman, Congressman Bowman, who called it aggressive except for Palestine. And you can be against racism. You can be against militarism. You can be against war, except when it comes to Palestine.
Yeah.
You can be against occupation and colonization, except when it comes to Palestine.
You can be sort of politically correct and politically woke on everything. But if you mention the right for Palestinians to have self-determination, if you even voice that they should stop being bombed, in this case, this is what a lot of young people are doing. They're asking for a ceasefire. Now they're also asking for an arms embargo. You're shut out, you're shut down, and then in some cases, you're called a terrorist, all kinds of things.
Face consequences all the way to the congressional hearings. Like there's really no limit if you feel like what people will do if you speak out on behalf of Palestine. And it's so Orwellian to watch full-on powerful adults call college students terrorists or terrorist supporters because they're asking for peace. I've never seen anything as upside down in my life as that. And we see it every day in the United States.
I wanted to just mention something about the hearings that I found interesting and we were sort of talking about while we were on the road filming this. Because Josh for Fault Lines did a film about the synagogue shooting, right?
Yeah.
On the Tree of Life.
Yeah.
Terrible. Anti-Semitic. I mean, really tragic. I mean, you had white nationalists go into a synagogue and shoot up people praying. Horrific. And this was the time of Trump, when Trump was also spewing a lot of anti-Semitic stuff. I don't remember any congressional hearings about anti-Semitism then. But they chose this moment when because people are conflating, right? they're conflating these ideas of what it means for Palestinians to have human rights with all these other things, right?
It's the same people who.
So they're conflating it with religion.
People on both sides of the Virginia Tech thing, where they're just chanting Jews won't work like us. Those same people that are defending them are now saying anti-Semitism rampant across campus.
Right.
And going after these students.
But you were in Charlotte. I mean, you went to
I
Charlottesville
was in Charlottesville.
and they had tiki torches.
Yes.
Where were the hearings on Capitol Hill about anti-Semitism and how rampant it is in the country? They chose this moment when students, people were speaking out for Palestinian rights. They chose that moment to crack down on who? It wasn't someone who shot up the people who have guns who were shooting up a synagogue or people who allowed it. It was academics, people who are running Ivy League institutions.
Kind of Orwellian when you see Jewish students being attacked as being anti-Semitic because they criticize the ideology of Zionism, settler colonialism, and yet you'll call this person anti-Semitic. And the one of our characters had dedicated her young life to teaching people the difference between anti-Semitism and Zionism, and now she's doxxed by Canary Mission, which is connected to and funded by the Israeli government, and doxxed as being anti-Semitic, regardless, but she's Jewish.
I mean, the first tenured professor that Josh was mentioning, Maura Finkelstein, is Jewish.
Right.
She was the first tenured faculty professor to be fired since, I think, talking out about Palestine, I think since after 9/11.
Wow.
I think there's no, yeah. So there you have it.
I have one more question and then we can open it up to the audience. Now, when it comes to documentary, creating a documentary is different than fictional. You know, with fiction, you write, you produce, and you do post-production. But with documentary, there's no writing. So it all depends on how, you know, your interviews go and your investigation goes. Do you think this based on your experience, was this documentary any different than any other documentary when it comes to finding people and interviewing them? Do you find it was more difficult? Because you did mention you had a couple of people who changed their minds halfway through or didn't want to do
I
it.
mean, we always have people who might be reluctant to talk for different reasons. We often hide identities to protect people, either protect their jobs or sometimes protect their actual physical safety. In Afghanistan or Iraq or more recently Ecuador had to hide someone to protect their identity. Or, yeah, Ohio. So no, I don't think this was particularly different in any way. Although I would disagree with something you said about there's quite a bit of writing that goes into it, because the way these things work for us is we pitch an idea to our executive producer, who's Larry, and if we're going to do, we move forward. We've got 4 to 5 weeks of pre-production probably, so we're on the phones calling everyone we can about the story, trying to just understand, to get in, to think about how could we tell this, and then who do we need to help tell this. And so then we start to try to gain access, and this is really something that Amina does far more than I do. And then the hard part is we get about 2 weeks of filming. We got to fit all these people in. Sometimes, like, you know, one's in Ecuador, one's in Montreal, and one's in LA, whatever. When we fly, you know, we're on the road, and we get all these voices. We spend sometimes days. The interviews go for hours. We come back with probably on average, is it fair to say 25 hours of filming? Joel Heron in the back has been filming Fault Lines for years and years. 25 hours or more of filming. We're going to come back and make 25 minutes of documentary. And then you got to go through all of it. You start pulling out and thinking of the best fights. You start thinking again about a different way to tell the story than you originally imagined it. And it goes through this whole editing process, editing 5 weeks.
It's a team.
And then, yeah, and you know, the great part is, like this one, our editor's in New Zealand. So you can write a scene, you can write all day. By the time he's waking up, it's the end of your day, he's getting a cup of tea, you send it to him, you talk about it, boom, you wake up and you've got a cut scene. And you look at it, you call him, you say, okay, I like this, not that. He goes to sleep, he comes up, you got a new script the next day. So it's really 24 hours that we've got this thing going now, that we're like on opposite sides of the world. 5 weeks straight of that, and then this is what you come up with. So.
I wouldn't say it's any different. necessary.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, yeah.
We're filming one right now, actually. We just rushed here from an interview, so we're going through the same process.
Okay, well, you wanna talk about that or leave it?
It's just about the election. It's like a postmortem about the election, so look out for it in November.
It'll come out the week after the election as kind of a first draft of history about what just happened, but not like the politics of it, more like what does this mean, this is who we are as a people, and what some of the larger trends are, where we're headed. That, in fact, Jamal Bowman's going to be in that piece as well, as is Jill Stein and Ryan Grimm, and there's a lot of kind of politicos around. There are going to be voices in that.
All right, any questions?
I'm not a question, I'm just gonna get rid of this projector real quick.
Hi, so, I'm actually, I'm only here for a semester. I'm a student at UT, as part of the UT system. I think you lecture at Archer.
Wait, you're part of the Archer Center?
We're both part of the Archers that are here on Archer, yes. And my question was just that I know you said that Fault Line documentary is trying to not have a call to action afterwards.
Yes.
However, I want to ask you both, individually as journalists and documentarians and producers, how you balance objectivity with moral duty, especially in the context of defending free speech and with what's going on, especially in the context of Palestine right now.
I rarely feel conflicted in that way. And for most things, like I'm probably not as involved on social media as most people. I don't tweet or I'm never giving my hot take on any, whatever the social media things are. I don't post much personal stuff there. So it's not too hard for me. I like to think that my body of work, I've done Fault Lines for 15 years. I've been in Observer for 20 years. And my body of work can speak for itself. That said, like I was just at an event last week in New York. And while on stage, I asked the audience to kind of pause for a moment, and we mentioned the Al Jazeera journalist that had been killed in Israel, to include, and an Al Jazeera journalist who's now trapped and couldn't come to this event. She's in Gaza. And I have no problem saying that they were murdered and that there's been no justice, like Shireen was an Al Jazeera journalist was murdered before October 7th by Israeli forces. It's with impunity. I can say those things factually. And I can also say that Palestinians are human beings and they deserve every right as human beings that I have. And that doesn't bother me as a journalist in any way. That said, I wouldn't do anything like a political endorsement or that kind of stuff because my body of work speaks for itself and you can make your own decisions on what you want to do with your actions from that.
Yeah, and similar for me, but I would say that my journalism, I think about journalism as not being, I really look at it from a lens of power and who I'm talking to and what position of power they're in. So I really think of my role as a watchdog as opposed to a lapdog, if that makes sense. So that came up in a recent interview. It was a great line. I was like, I'm going to use that. Yeah, came up in an interview recently. So I really think about that in terms of when we talk about objectivity. We're always very fair. We are fair in terms of giving someone a chance to respond. And it also makes the piece more interesting. If you ask a person, say it knows, you want to ask people in positions of power, you want them to answer those questions, right? You need to put them on the spot and give them a chance. You don't just censor them.
And every piece we do, we ask the people we're often investigating for a sit-down interview. And if they don't, we give them a right to reply, or we send them a written note saying, here's what we're saying line by line about you in this piece. If you want to reply to any of this. That's anyone from the State Department to maybe a shady business or whatever it is. Everyone gets a right to reply. And in terms of objectivity, we go through rigorous fact checking on every episode because we can be sued. Some of our producers have been sued in the 8-figure range. Those lawsuits went on for years. The other people lost because of rigorous fact checking. But objectivity doesn't mean that you don't have a point of view, but it does mean that you've done everything you can to tell the fairest story possible.
We have a good fact checker here on our team. So I just want to give a shout out to all the fact checkers. But yeah, it's about recognizing who's in a position of power and holding them accountable and being unafraid to do that. And I think, unfortunately, where our industry is at, we seem to have a real problem with that, especially in this time where it's so critical that we have people sort of for lack of a better phrase, holding feet to fire. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think you touched on this a bit in your introduction, but could you say some more about how long the film has been available, what kinds of platforms it's available on, and the size of your audience?
Sure. So Al Jazeera English is the channel that the show is broadcast on. That broadcast in about 100 countries and nearly 400 million homes. You know, this is one of the few places in the world where if I were staying in a hotel tonight, that I would speak to you and I'd go back to my hotel, that I wouldn't be able to turn on the TV and see CNN International, BBC World, and Al Jazeera English. Most of the world, you get these international channels. In America, our media is very domestically focused and we don't have the international channels as much. So that's our home. We also exist online. So 15 years worth of Fault Lines films. And just to toot our own home for a second, we've won multiple Emmys, Peabodys, DuPonts. We've won the awards. They're all on YouTube for free, forever, for everyone to see. They're also at aljazeera.com. Some of my favorite episodes that I've been the correspondent for are on joshrushing.com. So you can find them there. In terms of our viewership number, there's no such thing as a Nielsen's rating system around the world, so we don't really know our broadcast numbers. When we pay the money to do surveys, Al Jazeera English does extremely well across, we're the #1 news station across much of Africa, do really well in the Middle East, and then we have sizable audiences in Europe and Asia. We tend to judge the success in terms of, I have to say, the reason we can do the journalism we do is there is no commercial imperative. We're public broadcasting. Al Jazeera is funded by the government of Qatar, and it is basically the same charter that was used to set up the BBC. So I've never had anyone at the company, I've been there 20 years, say, you need to get more clicks or more views, or talk to me about advertising dollars or something like that. There's no business sense to it at all. The only mission is just go do the best journalism you can do, and they've never questioned a story or how I framed a story. But when we do wonder if a piece is clicking or not, we can look online and see the numbers on YouTube. Some of our episodes have millions and millions of views. Some of our episodes have thousands and thousands of views. Some of the best episodes I've done probably have less than 5,000 views. And so I try to not allow that to affect the way I see each piece in its own journalism, but some click and some don't.
Do you sometimes get these documentaries on public television, WETA, that sort of thing?
I wish that we had that kind of deal in the States. You know what, funny enough, in Australia, Dateline runs our episodes a lot of times. They buy them from Al Jazeera and they run them as an Australian Dateline episode. But in the States, no, we don't have any kind of like distribution partner. And you can get Al Jazeera that live, and you can get our show on every smart TV. There's an app. There's a little Al Jazeera app on your computer. It streams live on YouTube. The actual broadcast of Al Jazeera English is live on YouTube as well as on aljazeera.com. So Al Jazeera has really, in terms of the U.S. distribution, after they have a channel here for a while called Al Jazeera America. After that went down, I have just ignored this afternoon. I apologize. After that went down, Al Jazeera really leaned into making it available everywhere they could to smart TVs and computers and online in the U.S. They really looked at online distribution here.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And just a plug, Josh just got an Emmy for his Shark Fin episode. Shout out to Josh.
Shout out to Josh. Thank you. Thank you both for the work you do. First off, about Charlottesville, I spoke with Congressman Bobby Scott, who's the ranking member on the House Education Committee that you guys saw there. And he told me that in 2017, the Democratic side of the House committee that he leads, they were in the minority, so they had to request for hearings at the time. They requested that there be a hearing on the fact that there was basically a reenactment of the Nuremberg rally on an American college campus. And that request was denied by the same Congress people, including Virginia Fox, who have now led this series of, I don't know how many, 5, 6, 7, 8 hearings on anti-Semitism on American college campuses since October 7th. And they haven't had one about Islamophobia or anti-Arab racism or anything. So I think that's very interesting. But
the distinction's easy to understand, though. What happened in Charlottesville had nothing to do with Israel. It was about American Jews. And those Republicans don't care about that.
no, they don't.
This is about Israel, and that's who those Republicans are serving with those hearings. And so while they use these words, anti-Semitism, right, we're talking two different groups of people, and one has a lot more clout in Congress. It's not the American Jewish population that has that clout in Congress. It's Israel.
Yeah, exactly. That's spot on. But full disclosure, student next door at GW. But I wanted to know, why do you think it is that, here in DC, from the federal government, from state government, by the way, we heard the police sirens. That was Kamala Harris's motorcade. We've heard from her, Joe Biden, and then all the way down to university presidents. It's always framed as Islamophobia and not what it really is. Anti-Arab racism, anti-Palestinian racism. Even with Rashida Tlaib, when there was the disgusting cartoon of her with the exploding pager, they said it's Islamophobia, even though there's nothing about the fact that she's a Muslim there. It's directed to the fact that she's Arab, that she's Palestinian. So why is it framed in that way? Why is that framing decision made? Why is that narrative being pushed?
I have a theory, because this came up in conversations with us. It's convenient. It's politically convenient, is my theory. There were definitely when the young 6-year-old, and I'm from Chicago, when the young 6-year-old was stabbed, a lot of the sort of thoughts and prayers flooded in. Everyone from Elizabeth Warren to you on down. And it was, I condemn Islamophobia. There might have been some of that with this landlord, but if you see what he was watching what was the rhetoric. This was days after Joe Biden, the president, said that this quote that he said, we can't believe the numbers of the dead, essentially.
Yeah.
So that had a real impact. But I would say it's politically convenient. It's kind of like it's like, how do you call it? Soft politics. To say, yes, religion, you have the right, this religion is your right. But once you start saying, I would go so far to say it's not just anti-Arab, it's anti-Palestinian, right? So it's anti-Palestinian racism. But it's, that's the boogeyman. That's why we made this film. It's called The Palestine Exception.
Interesting point out the professor, the GW professor that we highlight in the middle is neither Islamic or Arab. And yet she's receiving all those, I'm sure you saw Islamic, it's all attacking her based on two identities that she doesn't even possess. She just for side note, she's Druze and
it doesn't matter. It's like, yeah. So I would, that's how I sort of imagine, that's my theory, is that it's politically convenient and sort of a soft way of getting at it.
Thank you.
Yeah, a question.
Hi.
Hi again. We saw you on the walk over here.
And a great T-shirt as well, by the way. You mentioned about the timeliness of this documentary, and I'm wondering if you struggled to kind of put a bow on it at the end, considering that it was a developing story. Did you at some point think maybe we should wait, maybe this will change, or how did you decide, all right, this was the time to take it to air?
I asked that question once at a screening of a documentary of one of our directors of photography, and he was also a friend of mine. And this was his independent bowling that he was doing on the side. And I was like, how'd you know when to end it? And he said, when I was out of money. The editor said he wasn't going on without more pay. And we said, that's the end of the film. For us, it's not that, but it is, we are on a deadline. Before when we pitch the story, we pitch it for a broadcast date. And so we know to broadcast by that date, it must be sent and completely done to Doha by this date. That means that color correction has to happen on these days. Sound mix has to happen on these days. That means that editing and final voice must be done on this date. And that means to do editing on the date, you need 4 weeks to write it. So shooting must be done on these dates. So literally from the time we pitch it, which let's say this was, like if I were to pitch a story now, it would be for a broadcast slot in March. That we would know the week it's going to come out, and then all your deadlines are set. And as much as I want to continue with every story that I do, just part of being a professional journalist is we hit deadlines and then we move on and we hit the next deadline. And so it was painful to watch the scenes that unfolded right there where we were filming when they called in the New York police SWAT military attack on these students, and to think wow, I wish we'd been filming on that date instead, but the piece was already done and out. So it's, yeah, you're like, but at the same time, I was already on 2 other stories, and you just hit them and keep moving.
Well, we were supposed to be, we were scheduled to actually be filming the day that they got sprayed. With the chemical. So I think you talking about the chemical spray at the very end, we talk about it. We were scheduled to be there, but we thought it was gonna be a snowstorm. So we're like, look, there's gonna be another event to capture, let's wait it out. And that happened to be the one that we missed, was the one where they did the spray. And we had a lot of conversations internally, like this feels really big. It feels crazy to have this film and be about, interviewing students at Columbia and not talk about that incident.
Should we tell people what the incident is for maybe those who don't know?
Oh, yeah, maybe.
It was at one of these student protests, like you saw something at Columbia, some students dressed up as if they were going to be protesters, and they walked through and they sprayed people with a chemical that put
At least 10.
In
At least 10 to a dozen, yeah.
In the hospital, and it ruined everything that they had and that they were wearing.
It's
the
similar.
Students were identified that did that, and they were Israeli IDF soldiers who were studying at Columbia. Their identities are known. The university has never done anything about it, but actually gone after the students who were sprayed instead. Those students did.
They had internal investigations.
With impunity.
They had internal investigations. They brought in the NYPD to investigate. But ultimately, I don't know if I know there's a conclusion to that, which is why we have to journalistically write allegation. But yeah, we had a lot of conversations internally about, oh my gosh, it's crazy that we're working on this film at this moment and we don't talk about it. But I think my arguments and sort of, we were talking as a group, and I said that would have been the whole film. It's very complicated. It's a moving story. This story is about what's happening with this kind of Palestine exception on campuses. And so that could be a film by itself. So we had to we decided to put, but I said, look, what we'll do is we should definitely incorporate it as sort of a title card at the end to inform people that this is happening, that there's these definitely lawsuits.
The nice part about the film being done before all the encampments and the police reaction was that the encampments actually screened the film at Columbia, at GW's encampment. Irvine. So the students got to, see it and appreciate that, I think, very unique environment.
And if I may ask us a quick follow-up, from your conversations with professors and faculty, did you get a sense that the university administrations hold any significant weight for pieces of content like this that spotlight their internal policies and how broken they are and their infringements on free speech? Do you feel like they care about the bad publicity that comes out from their decisions towards these students?
I would be guessing, but I don't think they care nearly as much about. I think they do care about the bad publicity, probably not our story to the extent that the American media, the blowback there, but not nearly as much as they care about what their donors think.
Yeah.
And that's a remarkable part of the story. In America, it's always been that people who have money have power, and we all know it. But it's generally done a little more in the back rooms. And this one, the billionaires like stepped out and they're like, they basically all but said it. I own this university. I give them the money and I'll turn the money off if they don't do what I want on this issue. I don't care what the students think. I don't care what the professors think. And I don't care what the presidents think.
Which is,
Yeah.
which is crazy when you think about what the role and purpose of academic institutions, higher, like especially higher ed institutions in this country, in a democratic country with a democracy, what the role is of those institutions. I mean, that's what's even more wild is sort of the dictating terms of free speech and academic freedom, right? And for the free, because those institutions represent the free flow of thought, the free flow of free thought.
In theory, they should.
Yeah, they should in theory.
In theory. But all that came out here that no, they're gonna do what the billionaires want them to do. Yeah. It really is. And that's helpful, I think. I mean, I hope people recognize that that's a change, that's a moment to register that the reality is out there. That their money isn't philanthropic. It shouldn't be a tax deduction because for them, it's not a donation, it's a purchase. It's a purchase of power at the university. And they want to control the ideas and they want to control what's being taught.
I have a question about the reality of, they're like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, people are still denying that it was immoral when at the time the generals were saying this wasn't necessary. The history books were covered up and they changed Sano tree. And then they put the truth out there and people still don't believe it. So is that because of censorship or self-censorship or what's going on with that? And I also documentary question. Seems like a lot of the budgets a lot of companies are going zero budget. So you use those cell phones. Is there a way to get around the zero budgets and through those documentaries?
No, we don't. We don't use it. As Joel will tell you, expensive camera equipment. Although you can't get away with using iPhones now, where you have to. I would highly encourage. This is I'm proud of this, but if you really want to see Beaumont at its best, there's a full-length documentary called "The Ninth Won't End." It's on YouTube. I didn't have anything to do with it other than support.
There's another one that just came out yesterday called Starving in Gaza, which is very relevant given that Lincoln knew that Israel was blocking that memo.
The Night Won't End, though, has incredible cinematography from inside Gaza. You haven't seen this on social media. This is beautifully shot in heartbreaking destruction. But there are some scenes in there that are shot with iPhones because they had to be. And I would challenge you to know which ones they were. So you can use phones, but there's a lot of reasons because of like audio issues. There's a lot of things that real cameras can do that phones can't do. So that was your first question, or second question. But about the first question in terms of like what people believe and don't believe is, we're at a point where not only have politicians gerrymandered people so that they now get to pick their voters rather than voters picking politicians, we've now gerrymandered our information systems. We've gerrymandered our news and media to the point that it matches very specifically to you and what you're watching. So it used to be if you told me your religion or where you lived, I could take a guess at your politics. Now all I need to know, where do you get your news? And I can tell you what you think about what's happening in Gaza. I can tell you what you think about what's happening in the US. And so we're at this point where I think we've got to break out of these tiny little silos we've invented for ourselves. But that's why people will not believe evident truths at times, is because they're not getting that information in their very selective media.
that they're watching, and I too am in that. This is a societal thing that I think we need to reconsider the way we're bringing in information at this moment that would address that.
Just about the iPhones, if there's any, whether online or in this room, students or young people who are interested in this line of work, one of the best things I learned when I was first getting into this and interested was the best camera is the one you have. So just go do it, basically. So that's what I would say. I mean, I'm lucky that I have people like Joel to work with and sort of, I work with great cinematographers, and we have great equipment, but especially if you're just starting out, it's like, use the camera you have. I remember I went out to the West Bank in 2010 as like a little baby, my 20s, just deciding to go out there. And I had a flip cam. Does anyone know what a flip cam is? It's like it almost looks like a chunky cell phone, and then you flip it, and it has a USB that you stick into your camera. And I basically would just, and I came back and I edited something out of it, but it's.
During the Bahrain uprising, when they cracked down on the media, we had journalists in there with cell phones filming, and this was almost 15 years ago. iPhones were new, and we got a whole documentary out of that. I'm blanking on the name of it, but it won a big award. And that was all cell phones.
So use the camera you have, document.
Thank you very much for your work. Josh, you've partly answered my first question. I'd agree you'll ask two, if I may. You partly answered my first question, which was your sense for, what the reason was or is for this crackdown on free speech with respect to any aspect of the Palestinian nation. It's obviously built sponsorship with loss thereof, perhaps political pressure. I don't know if there's, as misplaced as it might be, some genuine concern about Semitism. As I say,
I have a real specific answer to that.
And the second question was, how much pushback do you as Al Jazeera journalists get when trying to approach folks for these kinds of documentaries or storylines to work? I mean, there's been a narrative against Al Jazeera for a while. Again, misplaced. So I just wondering, it must be.
I'll let you the second one first, and if I forget the first one, remind me. So how much pushback do we get being Al Jazeera in the United States, right? In a prior life, I was a U.S. Marine for 14 years. I led the Marines over the invasion of Iraq, and I helped start Al Jazeera English. There was a documentary film that included me as a military officer in it, called Control Room. It was one of the reasons that I left. When I helped start Al Jazeera English, I did a lot of press in America, to the point of being on the cover of magazines, on the Today Show, on Bill O'Reilly and John Handy, or on Terry Gross's Fresh Air a couple times, those kind of things, right? You can still Google my name and go look at images, and you'll find like how they used to advertise when I was coming on Fox. They would show me in uniform. It would say Josh Rushing. It would say traitor, question mark. And I give Fox a hard time, but I was on the Today Show, and they strapped me with Josh Rushing, anti-American, question mark. So I am fully aware of the difficulty Al Jazeera's reputation has had in the United States. I used to go to interviews and have federal officers follow me, go in and tell the person that I interviewed that there were national security consequences to them having spoken to me. And then they would call me scared and say, I didn't know, please don't use my interview. Our offices were on 16th and K, which is 2 blocks from the White House. I went to North Dakota to tell a story about small towns disappearing, and Fox News ran a ticker that Al Jazeera was probing the northern border. So I'm fully aware, and I can't tell you how many times I've had to call Middle America and say, no ma'am, Al-Qaeda is something different. And so is Al Gore, and other words that begin with Al. So I get that. But you know when that really changed in the States was Tahrir Square in Egypt with the uprising there. The week that was happening, American media wasn't covering it yet in the first week. In fact, what they were covering was Charlie Sheen had some kind of a meltdown in a hotel room with prostitutes and cocaine in New York. And I think he was supposed to do an interview on Piers Morgan, which was the biggest CNN show at the time, and he didn't show, and Piers interviewed an empty chair. And it was Sheen America. Meanwhile, the Middle East is going through a political revolution for the first time in a generation, right? And so people started pouring onto our servers to watch it to the point that Al Jazeera servers crashed, and we had to get them back up. We had a huge boom at that point. Well, at this point, we're still trying to explain the difference between Al Qaeda and Al Jazeera. That moment, the Secretary of State was Hillary Clinton. She was called in front of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to give testimony under oath about what was happening in Egypt. And she said, unprompted, we're getting our best information from Al Jazeera. She said there's no talking heads, there's no commercials, and it's like news from the ground. And we're watching this going, like, what just happened? You know, and from there, our reputation started to change. And then it was a couple years later that we won the Peabodys, the DuPonts, the Emmy. And so we've gone through a reputational change that we really, honestly, was in the rearview mirror until October 7th. And then it's come back some. So like at the RNC, I would ask people, hey, would you like to speak? And they say, who are you with? Say, Al Jazeera. And they go, oh, I'm not going to talk to you Hamas lovers and like these kind of things. It's like, oh, wow, I've been here before. But that's okay because it's whatever, right? The people who think that are probably not my audience anyway. So yes, we have faced reputational challenges. I will say, I can't tell you how many times people have said, why don't you guys just change the name? Americans will like be more open to it if you change the name. And I'm always like, F you, the name's the point. Like we are Al Jazeera, we're not changing for anybody. Like Americans aren't the only people in the world. You know, there's 7 billion people in the world and we're actually kind of here for them more than you, so.
Al Jazeera, for people who don't speak Arabic, means the peninsula.
The peninsula, which Qatar is a
Just so
peninsula.
people know what that means.
Yeah, and then the first question you asked got a specific answer to it. And it was, why is there such a strong reaction to any kind of speaking about Palestine? And the specific answer, and there's not a lot of books about this. One of the ones I enjoyed the most was James Bamford is a writer in DC who writes a lot about CIA and NSA. And he has a book called Spy Fell. Came out about a year ago. It's about counterterrorism failures in the US. It looks at Russia, China, North Korea, and Israel. The Israeli part of the book is jaw-dropping. Jaw-dropping. And I can tell you, one of the how can I put this? Okay, the guy that was responsible for getting nuclear triggers out of the US into Israel so they can have nuclear bombs is a Hollywood producer. A Hollywood producer that you guys have seen his movies and loved, to include 12 Years a Slave and most of everything Robert De Niro's done in the last 20 years. This is his producer. And he is an Israeli spy. And how he became a producer was he was in South Africa working with the apartheid regime down there in the 80s. To get them weapons when there was an embargo against them getting weapons. He was getting them Israeli weapons. And South Africans realized they were losing a PR war in America and that he should come here and try to help them in that regard with the messaging. And so he came here, and the first thing he did as a producer was a Broadway musical that was about happy blacks under apartheid in South Africa. It was heavily
librarian. And it's quieter, obviously. It doesn't get as much press as what's going on in the university. And there's no big donors, right? The only donors is taxpayers and politicians, like the head of school boards. But second graders, fourth graders, our county had 4 teachers being put on leave for social media posts. So it's like, definitely, there's a teacher right now in Philadelphia that's completely doxxed by like an ADL group, that just did the whole thing that you explained here for the university level. So just.
Yeah, I mean, it's happening at all levels,
Yeah.
quite frankly. This doesn't have to do with K through 12, but you reminded me of a story that I remember reading about and just thought was outrageous. It was happening around the same time. There was this, in New York, there was a prenatal nurse who takes care of babies in the NICU or something. And she had just won an award for her, for her compassion, especially towards mothers who had lost children. And so this was, I think she might have been Palestinian American. She was Palestinian American in New York and had received an award from the hospital or from the Association of Nurses or something for her extreme compassion. She had posted essentially a sympathy for mothers in Gaza who are losing their babies. And someone can remind me, but she received some consequences for that. I mean, if that isn't a sign that identifying Palestinians as humans has consequences and like that extreme, then that's the best example. I mean, you're talking about a, neonatal nurse who received an award for compassion. She was fired.
Yeah.
That's right, she was fired. Imagine.
I have kids in the Fairfax system, and at the high school there, my son talks about this issue, and it's a real issue. And in fact, they had a walkout. Someone took photos of the walkout, and it was put into the end of the year yearbook. And the principal had to apologize that photo was put in there with an email out to all of the parents.
Yeah.
Just for, I guess, acknowledging that they did that.
All right, we'll take one last question.
Okay, better be a good one. No pressure, but I know the Archer Center, and this is the last question. So think this through. Think this through.
First of all, thank you all for speaking today. And what would you all say about the framing of self-censorship, especially coming from Texas, that conservatives have had to face? Whereas in reality, what's actually happening is the Palestine exception, where our professors and our friends are facing speech suppression and sanctions. While instead there's this kind of narrative being pushed that it is in fact the conservative students like Young Americans for Freedom and groups of the like that are being suppressed.
It's a weird twist on the idea of First Amendment. And I found myself in this conversation with conservatives in Texas at some point where they're like, we're very concerned about First Amendment. And I'm like, yes, me too. And then I realized they're talking about so they can say racist, misogynist things. And I'm like, oh, okay. And I mean, the Supreme Court protects First Amendment for the language that, especially the language we don't like, especially the language that we're uncomfortable with. Because language that we like and we're comfortable with doesn't need protections. That exists easy and freely in society. So unless it's an actual incitement of violence, then that language is protected. And I don't necessarily agree that by not platforming every voice on every single stage is a suppression of First Amendment. And so I'm thinking about some of the like uber conservative racists who were not being allowed to speak at universities, that being a First Amendment issue. It's not, they're not facing political consequences. They're not being arrested. They're not being pulled into court for things they're saying. You just have communities saying, we know what you're saying, we don't want to hear it. And we're not going to hear it here, right? But that's so twisted that they want to protect that, while at the same time, like this should be shut down. That the real exception, and this has gone back for years, and just October 7th has exposed it for what it is that there has long been an exception about Palestine on academic campuses, when it comes to free speech, and when it comes to progressive politics. And if you think about what Dr. Martin Luther King said that we should fight against racism, capitalism, and militarism, it is all wrapped up in these issues. And we honor him with a day every year, and yet we turn our backs on the very things he says that we should be challenging. And that's where we are.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Josh and Amina. Saeed Arikat apologizes. He had to leave because he has a program with Al Jazeera English. So I think it's your people that made him leave.
I was so relieved I didn't have to answer a question.
Yeah, but thank you for everything that you do. I mean, journalism and storytelling is one of the most powerful tools to create change. And thank you for everything you do. The work that you do is amazing. And I can't wait till I watch Starvation in Gaza.
Yeah, and please,
Yeah,
if you
Starvation in
watch,
Gaza.
share, and also if you have other avenues for screenings, we love doing this. And we have our colleagues are here, like Layla's here, and other colleagues they can bring in, or they can remote in if you have, other institutions or whatever that want to have screenings. We love, I mean, this is, I know we talked about like impact and not having a call to action, but I think impact is important for everyone. And people, and seeing it and being engaged. I mean, I think that that's the important thing, is being engaged, not becoming numb to everything.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for coming out. Great. Awesome.
How was it?
Very good, very good. You always have more questions than answers, don't you?
And our camera moves. Not a big I don't know. She's the one who basically creates film, manages it, writes the script, and does all of this. We have lots of different. I thought you were like. Very good. It's collaborative. It's very collaborative. He's involved with interviews.